All right, welcome to Teaching Interactives, a free webinar with me, Melissa. It's about engaging students in constructing understanding through our new product offering, which are some interactive activity worksheets. Before we get started, I wanted to give you guys first a chance to tell me how familiar you are with our organization, NGPF. So I'm going to post our first poll. All right, so it looks like most of you are pretty familiar with our resources. Some of you use them more than others, and some of you are brand new. So we will make sure that we use a wide variety of structure today in the webinar so that we get the information to all of you and meet you where you are. So let's get started. First and foremost, I just want to say happy October. I know as a former teacher that October is a great month with students. You're back in the swing of things. You know everybody's name. The students are happy to be in class and you're in the swing of all your classroom norms. So happy October and happy month of Halloween. So our session today is about teaching and learning through interactives. So first I thought we'd ask the question, why interactives? And I usually like to frame thinking about this idea from some comments personal finance teachers make. Sometimes they say students can find the content a little abstract. You know, they don't really manage their own money much yet, or maybe they're not investing quite yet in their life. Maybe they're not ready to buy a car and they're learning about that content. Sometimes teachers say, although the content might have to do a lot with the student, that students get bored. And I think that can be true with any subject matter. And that also has to do with the fact that personal finance might not be as flashy as, say, the demonstration in chemistry or the big debate in their humanities class. So those are some of the things I've heard from personal finance teachers. And the more interactive that you can make the material, the more students will understand that material and the more buy-in that you will get. So the answer to that question, why interactives? I like to think of it in a group of different ways. The first is that you have that buy-in, the intrinsic motivation to learn about something rather than learning towards an external goal like a grade or because your teacher told you to. Also some further engagement because students are more interested when they're seeing things change on their screen and maybe they become a little more curious. I also like to think a lot about the introverts in the room who don't love to discuss or speak up or ask questions. And this allows them to be active learners because they can ask that question in their head and go find it out through using the interactive. But it's not excluding the extroverts. They can still talk all they want about what's going on. So I find it to be a really inclusive learning tool. It's clearly a lot more experiential than many of the other learning tools that you can give students. So putting themselves in a place where they're actually experiencing the material rather than hearing about it or reading about it is always best. And the last one, which I think is possibly the most important, is that interactives allow students to make small failures in a really low stakes environment. So they can, spend a lot of money on something ridiculous in one of these interactives, maybe when they're playing a game, but that doesn't really impact their actual financial wellness. So it's a good learning tool in the sense that they can learn from their failures. So I'm going to launch my second poll, which is about interactives. So if all of you would do me a favor and please respond to this next poll, that would be great. All right, so it looks like a lot of us, might use interactives, but only when they find a really good one. And some of us really love them, so hopefully you'll find more that you can use. And if you've never used one before or you're not quite sure about them yet, this webinar will really give you a good idea of whether or not you want to use them. Awesome. All right, so let's move on. So as I mentioned, my name is Melissa. I work here at NextGen Personal Finance as a curriculum developer. Uh, and I'm really excited to share with you this new project we've been working on, which is to find and curate the best interactive tools we can find and or help develop and create activities around those interactives for students to learn some of the most important things the interactives can show. So as you noticed, I will be polling you guys to better understand where you're coming from so I can offer the best resources and advice along the way. But please feel free to type in questions as I'm talking in the question box, and I will break periodically once I notice a buildup of questions, and I'll make sure I get those questions answered. So don't be afraid to ask them. All right, so let's move on. First, I want to tell you our objectives for the day to model good teaching. So first and foremost, I'll discuss how to access the interactives on our website, where you can find them easily and where you can find activities, how to navigate, etc. Secondly, I'm going to highlight an example of categories of interactives that we have curated. First is interactive data, so having students analyzing different type of data, in different forms, graphs, charts, or sorting. The next would be interpreting results, and that's to taking a quiz or using a calculator based on personal information. And lastly, experiencing the ideas, so through games and simulations. Then we're going to discuss how you would implement these interactives in your classroom in a number of ways. I'll go over those more in depth, and you can ask questions if you have them. And lastly, I'll be here to answer any of your interactive questions that you might have. So finding interactives. So you say, okay, I really want to see the ones that NGPF has to offer, or I just want to peruse. So you'd have to go to our website, ngpf.org. Once you're on our website, you're looking for a piece of curriculum. So you go to the curriculum tab, and actually down at the bottom is the interactive library. If you pull up our interactive library, we have a little blurb about what interactives are. And what you'll find is that we have created a library that organizes interactives from the internet in terms of the link to the interactive itself, the topic that surrounds that interactive in personal finance, a description of what you're going to do in that interactive, what the student will do, the publisher, the time the interactive takes, not the time the activity takes. So for instance, that time next to the MASH calculator that says 5 minutes actually just means the time it takes to complete that quiz. And then lastly, when we've created an activity for that particular interactive, you'll see a little icon that says docs. And when you click on that icon, our NGPF activity that correlates with the interactive itself pops up. So for this one, the MASH calculator, for instance, would pop up because I clicked on the docs. So that's how you would find interactives. You would go to this interactive library and you'd scroll through. You can also use this search tool to find something you're interested in. So for instance, maybe you're like, investing. Sometimes I can't explain things to my students because they just don't understand the terms. Well, I could pop up this series of investing interactives using the search bar at the top, and then I could find an interactive that has to do with the investing topic that I'm looking to teach. So that's how our interactive library is helpful, and as I mentioned, the interactive activity worksheets that correspond can be found in the docs column. Secondly, if you're not purely looking for interactives, you'll notice that NGPF offers a series of activities regardless of the unit. So if I wanted to look just for activities in a particular unit, and let's just stick with investing since we're on that topic. And if you go to the investing unit and you go to activities, you'll notice that we have all of these activities also listed along with the unit activities. So they're not necessarily going to be separate. We embed them in our curriculum, But we also, in case something doesn't fit into the curriculum currently, we also offer more interactives in the library with the worksheets. So if you're looking to incorporate interactives into your own curriculum, I would definitely err on the side of using the library because it's a little bit easier to find things that you need. All right, so after finding the interactives on our website, you might say, what type of skill am I looking to have students do? And as I said, in my opinion, there are three categories that a lot of the interactives we curate allow. The first is interactive data. So it would be data sets that have been collected by a certain organization or company or news source, and they have been put into an interactive graph, chart, or data sorting tool, which I'll show you examples of later. And students would then have to analyze that data and play around with the interactive to find trends, to find relationships, to find cause and effect, etc. Same thing with charts, where they can compare and contrast, and data sorting, where they can make predictions or assumptions and then see if they were right or wrong. The second category would be interpreting results. So maybe they take a quiz about themselves or about a case story. Maybe they want to calculate a certain value or whether or not something will happen in the future. And then they'd interpret those results based on what they put in the quiz and what they found out, or the calculator. And lastly, there are these experiences. So games and simulations where the student becomes the person experiencing a personal finance topic. And I'll show those examples to you as we continue. So first, let's start with the analyzing data interactives. So I'm going to highlight an interactive in each of these categories to show you some of the best ones I think that are out there. The first one would be a graph, and this one is checking your tax rate between a certain number of years. And this so within the worksheet, you will always find a link to the interactive itself. So students pull up the Google Doc, it's pretty easy to navigate to the interactive. And what you'll notice about this one is that you can change the taxable income for the period of time, which the most recent period of time would make the most sense. And the graph changes depending on it. So right now it's on $50,000, and it tells you what your tax rate is over those particular periods of time. But if I change my taxable income to $500,000, it shows me how the tax rate changes based on the amount of taxable income. And so students can think about how that taxable income affects tax rate. They can also think about whether people are single or married, whether they're married but separate, head of the household, and how that affects your tax rate as well. So we developed an activity around this particular graph that allows you to look at the period of time and what the tax rates were in that period of time and relate that to the concept of inflation and the inflation adjusted income. And we also wanted them to understand how tax rates change based on what your filing status is. So it helps them define that as well. So what you'll see with these interactive activities is that you can do a lot with the interactive, but the worksheet hones in on the big ideas that you might want to bring home with your students. Next, I want to show you an example of interactive data in terms of a chart. So this interactive has to do with the index fund, the S&P 500. Index funds, in my opinion, are pretty difficult to explain to students because they look like this. But this interactive chart allows you to change the time period of performance for different stocks. So for instance, if I go to 1 year performance, it'll show me how well the stocks in the index fund do over time. And based on the colors, you can see, wow, there's a lot of green on this map. And even though there's some red, there's much more green. And students can make an assumption about how that will impact how the S&P 500 or an index fund will do. And in my opinion, it's a great visual representation. It allows you to look at particular industries, and within those industries, particular companies, and how they're doing over time. And you can also relate that on a time frame. So you can compare the 1 year performance to the 1 day performance. And you'd see like Google is doing incredible over the past year, but in a day it went down. And you can talk students through the reasons that that might be the case. And we created this follow-up activity that explains how the chart works, but then asks students to look at that 1 year performance for different industries. So we asked them to look at internet industries, like internet providers, excuse me, but we also asked them to look at a second industry and to try and understand maybe how that industry did as a whole in terms of that interactive map. So they'd have to look at particular companies in that industry and what that meant about the industry at large. So that is a great example of interactive data in terms of a chart. Lastly, there are these sorting tools that are quite interactive as well. The one I'd like to highlight is about which colleges help low-income students the most. So if you go to this one and you click on the interactive, sorry, my internet is not cooperating. There we go. All right. When we look at this, this is a data sorting tool. So you have the option to change school categories. So I can choose master's colleges, I can choose research universities, associate's degree, bachelor's degree. I'll choose bachelor's degree, for instance. And then I have options. I'll choose a public 4-year bachelor's degree. And it tells me the percentages of students who receive Pell Grants and the average cost for low-income students, the average discount for low-income students, the median federal debt of the Pell Grants. So it allows me to sort through all of this data of schools and universities in the country based on their category and find out the highest percentage of students that receive Pell Grants and the lowest percentage of students that receive Pell Grants, and then think about whether or not that college might be a good option. And so our activity frames it in a very similar way. It asks students to think about public 4-year research universities and then use the process of filling in a spreadsheet to figure out how much aid those particular schools are giving based on the data. So they want to compare the sticker price with the net price and figure out if that university is a good option for them. And this is just a great tool to help students understand the idea of paying for college and how to make college decisions based on the set of criteria they have for where they want to go to school or where they aspire to go to school, as well as the financial concerns. All right, so those are our interactive data tools: graphs, charts, sorting, and they always look different, but these are 3 great tools that students can play around with and learn from. And later in the webinar, I'll discuss a little bit about the ways you can use them in your classroom other than simply giving them our worksheet handout and the interactive itself. The next category is interpreting results. So looking at calculators or quizzes. So the first one that we looked at earlier was the MASH calculator in terms of how much does my lifestyle cost. So students would take this calculator and fill in their personal preferences and information. And it would only take a few minutes, but after they fill in right here, this personal information in the quiz, they would get a result, which I've highlighted right here as mine on my PowerPoint. Not necessarily accurate, but not bad. And it will tell you how much your lifestyle will cost, and it allows students to think a little bit about budgeting, about the future, maybe about what type of career they might want to have if they want a certain lifestyle, or how to adjust. So they'd have to interpret those results, and our activity asked them to do that. So basically it asked them to look at their lifestyle, and then based on what they got in the quiz the first time, they can take it a second time, since it only takes 5 minutes, and try to adjust and prioritize based on what they think maybe their lifestyle should cost instead. Or maybe they want to keep it the same and they can argue why. Another interpretation of results tool are quizzes, and this one I think is very helpful considering current events. And it is a quiz that allows you to see how many times you've been hacked. And it's from the New York Times. And basically what you do is you fill in this information, whether or not you have a credit report, have you applied for a job, have you signed up for websites in particular years? And you'll notice on the PowerPoint here that what ends up happening, pointing to it with my mouse, is it tells you how many times your pieces of your information have been exposed. So this can open up a broader conversation about financial pitfalls and security and scams. It can also allow students to think a little bit about how they disseminate their information on the internet to be more responsible consumers, which I think is a great tool. So the quizzes and calculators are great for if you want students to interact with the computer very quickly, but you want more of an abundance of interpretation and discussion. All right, so the last category of interactives to me are games and simulations. And these to me are interactives that you can build out into larger scale days of class. So there are two largely highlighted and recognized simulations by this company called McKinney that we actually partnered with to create this game called Payback. The game Spent has been around for quite some time and is similarly engaging. But I'm actually just going to demo Payback for the sake of time. So, so if I go to timeforpayback.com, you'll see that this is a much more interactive game where students are going to play the game based on their own set of understandings and criteria, and they're going to learn about things along the way. So I'm just going to demo the beginning, which shows you, you pick a GPA, so you can have students pick the GPA they currently have or the GPA they want, maybe what they're currently involved in or maybe what they want to be involved in, and maybe their home state, or they can play around but pretend to be someone else. Then they'd have to pick a school, and they'll see the repercussions of that school over time. And the game designers have made the game very comprehensive and easy to use, everything labeled, and they learn as they go. So they're making real-time decisions. And this was that concept I talked about in the beginning, where they can make failures or wrong decisions and really learn from themselves. So if I decide to treat myself and spend some money, it says the best way to reduce student loan debt is to save as much as you can before college. So that's like a big thing that sticks out with these types of experiences. I'm not going to go through and play the whole game of Payback, but if you haven't, I'd urge you to get on and play it, because it is a fantastic experience for students in thinking about college, thinking about budgeting, debt management, careers, college majors. It kind of scopes a lot of different topics. And then this is our handout that accompanies it. And the handout really wants students to think about their decision-making process when they play the game. Why did they choose a certain thing, and what is the outcome of choosing that? And what lessons are they going to carry along with them in real life from that game experience? So it's not only experiencing what it's like to be a college student and try and manage your debt, but what are you going to take from that experience and apply to your life? So that's Payback. And as I said, Spent is a very similar idea from the same company. I also wanted to give you guys the benefit of attending this webinar and show you a sneak peek of a simulation that we are going to be releasing in a couple weeks. And this is, do you think you can pick stocks? So Think You Can Pick Stocks is a simulation of trying to play the stock market. And in my opinion, the best thing about it is that students can't choose companies that they already know anything about because they disguise all the names. So for instance, in round one, they're telling me to pick a company by description that I want to invest in. So I'm going to pick Gadget. Personal computers, to me, this company became a device innovator. So I'm like, yeah, innovation always wins. So I pick Gadget. And then it tells me how Gadget does. And it tells me how Gadget does compared to the other companies as well as how Gadget does compared to the S&P 500. So that's also an interesting part of this when you're talking about investing and you're having students think about index funds compared to stocks. And here you'll see that Apple did super, super well, and the S&P 500 is pretty steady. But you'll also notice I didn't really invest for that long. I invested for 10 years, which is pretty long, but I lucked out. And if you go to round 2, they'll then ask you to consider the stocks in terms of a different idea. So not just choosing a stock in terms of like what they do in their description, but now price to earnings ratio. And so students either have learned about that term before or are going to learn about that in this process. And our handout allows students to take a look at how they did in each round based on choosing a stock in a variety of different ways and reflect on how difficult it might be to choose stocks in general when investing. So that's a sneak peek into an upcoming product. All right, so before we move on, I just wanted to see if there are any questions. So feel free to type your questions into the question box, and I will be sure to answer them. I'm going to give you guys about a minute or two to write them in. All right, so even if some of you are still typing in questions, that's great. I'm just going to start answering some of these because they, I think, are pertinent to a lot of people. The first one asks if they can be sorted for middle school versus high school. Actually, we have just finished creating our first round of middle school materials in personal finance, and those will be launched on our website on November 9th as a hard launch. So you'll be able to access all middle school materials. And there are actually middle school versions of Payback Spent and plenty of other middle school related interactives that you can find in the middle school library. Please email me if you're interested in getting those sooner rather than later. But these ones are specifically for high school, although they can be adapted for middle school if need be, if you don't want to reach out about the middle school materials that are soon to be released. Another question was our role plays on Google Docs. Yeah, so all of these activities that I've pulled up are all accessible through Google Docs. We do that on purpose. That way you can make a copy. Go up here, File, Make a Copy, and then you can make your own copy of that Google Doc and edit it however you see fit for your classroom. All right, next question. Meal plans in college. Oh, for payback. Yeah, so it says the standard $0. Yeah, at a lot of state universities, including actually the one I went to, you don't have to pay for a meal plan if you get the standard one because it's included in your tuition. You just have to pay more money if you want extra stuff or different stuff than the standard. All right. And somebody asked, is this being recorded? Yes, this webinar is being recorded. Although I'm trying to speak slowly, I'm sure there's a lot coming at you. So it'll be recorded, sent to you in a follow-up email, and also accessible on our website. So you'll be able to rewatch it and access all the slides as well if you'd like to see them. All right, I believe that's all of the questions I have thus far. We will stop again for another round of questions towards the end, so I'm going to move on for now. All right. So ways to use these in your classroom. So I've touched on this along the way, but there are a number of ways that you can use interactives in your classroom. So I'm sure many of you can see that they're a great way to engage your students. They're not only are they fun, but they're also a great way for students to ask their own questions and then answer their own questions. So I think that that's clear. But what's not always clear is how to put them into your curriculum. So I'd say the first thing you can do, of course, is to assign one of our NGPF interactive activity worksheets. Maybe you've customized them a bit, maybe you just give them to them. You can assign them, they have to fill them out, you're going to collect them, and you grade them. Awesome, that's what they're meant for. But what you can also do is give students the worksheet to guide and tell them, write your notes down on them, fill this in if you'd like, don't if you don't feel like you need to, but be ready to discuss afterwards. And so you use the worksheet to make sure they're being metacognitive about what they're doing, but then you're going to have a big class discussion afterwards. And that way they are honed in on the importance and they have a direction, maybe if there's a ton of data or different choices, but you don't have to collect it. You can also simply have your students play with the interactive, just see what they can find out. Ask them, find something that interests you, find something that surprises you, or find something that was difficult. Questions like that. And then you can use our discussion questions to help your class reflect. So maybe you don't hand those out, maybe you put those on the board or up on a PowerPoint. But the idea is you could just use those discussion questions after they play the interactive to allow students to reflect on their experience. And then lastly, something that I think can also work with many of these interactives is that you can have students just explore the interactive themselves without a worksheet, and maybe work with a partner where they're kind of trying to find out as many things as they can, or they're just playing around. Sometimes some very organic learning moments can happen if you just have them play around. So that any of those options are up to you. I would suggest taking a look at the interactive in the worksheet ahead of time and deciding if it works for your students, because you know them best, and implementing it in one of these ways based on that. So hopefully you have from this webinar, you have a full scope of understanding in terms of what interactives are, because that name can be pretty fluid, but here at NGPF, we believe that they're internet tools that allow students to interact with data, results about their lives or somebody else's, or to actually experience personal finance concepts in games and simulations. And our new product offering are worksheets that help students hone in on specific ideas that they might want to learn. And lastly, I hope you got some good examples of things you want to use in your classroom and maybe some ideas of ways to implement them. So I want to make sure I continue to answer questions. So I'm going to break for a second and allow you all to kind of reflect or collect yourselves, and please type in any questions you have before we move on. All right, so one question I got was that if I make a copy of the Google Docs in my personal drive, how will I know when you update the lessons? Anytime that we do a revamp or update, we actually send out an email blast to all of our users that says that we have revamped or updated that unit or that part of the course. So that way you always know, oh, okay, I should go back and make another copy. It would be pretty abnormal for us to update something and not relaunch it or note it somewhere for you that's easy to access. But if that is the case and you notice it, please always reach out to us and we'll make sure that we tell other people. Our customer service is something we pride ourselves on here. So it looks like there are no more questions for now, and that's very much okay. I just want to say, if you have questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to me about interactives or anything else. I'm always here to help and to answer questions. I hope that you got something out of this session, and if you used a lot of interactives before, maybe you found out about some new ones that you might want to use next. If we're pretty unfamiliar but wanted to try, hopefully you feel a little more comfortable after this session using them. All right. So next steps. So after this webinar, you will get a survey auto-launched to you. If you missed that auto-launch for some reason, I tried to include a link to that survey also in your follow-up email. That survey just helps me get better at being a webinar host and helping you all learn how to use our tools. So please fill that out. I'd really appreciate it. Also, please start using interactives and our interactive activity worksheets in your class. Try them out. Let us know what you think. Keep an eye out for your certificate for completing this PD. And if you have any further questions about NGPF, you can follow up on our Help Center page. And as I mentioned, always email us. Most important next step is have a fantastic rest of your fall. Wherever you are in the country, I hope that you either stay warm or the weather is not too rainy. And please, as I mentioned, contact me. My email is on this slide, melissa@nextgenpersonalfinance.org. If you have any questions about interactives or anything else, and our website and some of our social media tags are on there as well. Thank you guys very much for attending. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.